Hey everyone, and welcome to the show. Imagine, just imagine for a second, a society where, the institutions that are meant to protect you and provide for you
Yeah.
are the very things that are causing unimaginable suffering.
Yeah.
Like, literally, where a million people die, not just from some natural disaster, but like a very specific, I don't know, chilling combination of neglect and ideology.
Yeah.
And that's kind of what we're going to get into today.
Yeah, it's heavy.
A deep dive into the Great Famine in Ireland.
Yeah.
We're going to look at all this historical analysis, all the different socioeconomic forces at play that turned what started as a blight into an absolute catastrophe.
Mm-hmm.
So if you're into this kind of deep dive into the past, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe for more.
Yeah, definitely.
So the main source that we're going to be using for this really harrowing journey is Scanlan's Fraught, an Imperial History of the Irish.
Mm-hmm.
You can find the link to that down in the description. But Rot isn't just boring dates and names.
Right.
It's a super powerful examination of the relationship between Ireland and the British Empire during this time of crazy hardship and societal upheaval. And Scanlan does a great job of teasing out those deeper, uncomfortable truths about how, imperial attitudes and the economic beliefs actually contributed to this tragedy that's often oversimplified and really conveniently forgotten.
Yeah, for sure.
So we're going to try to unpack some of these really crucial layers today and hopefully walk away with a better understanding of this moment in history. Okay, so let's jump right in.
Let's do it.
All right, so picture this. County Cork, February 1847. We're in year 2 of this devastating famine. And we've got Richard Webb, who is like a Church of Ireland rector. He sends 2 reliable guys to survey the conditions of the poorest families in the parish. And what they found was absolutely shocking. You've got families crammed into these damp, just completely dilapidated hovels.
Wow.
Farmers even called them cursed cottages.
Really?
They were barely even shelters. And here's the really interesting part. The authorities in Dublin and London were super skeptical.
Oh, wow.
They actually thought that the rural poor were exaggerating their suffering.
Interesting.
So, what does that tell us about the relationship between Ireland and Britain at that time?
Yeah, that skepticism is a huge deal, and it really reflects the kind of power dynamic at play. So leading up to the famine, Ireland did have its own parliament in Dublin, but its independence was super limited, especially after 1783.
Right.
They gave some concessions because, honestly, they were afraid of another American-style rebellion.
Wow.
And then you've got the United Irishman Rebellion in 1798, inspired by revolutionary France, which ultimately led to the creation of the United Kingdom in 1801.
Yeah, the Act of Union. It was supposed to be this big security measure, prevent a potential French invasion through Ireland. But they also made all these promises of shared prosperity and a unified market,
Right.
a single currency, all these things.
On paper, sounds great.
Yeah, on paper it sounds great.
A marriage made in heaven.
A marriage made in heaven. But as you said, it didn't quite work out that way, right?
Yeah. No, not really. That whole idea about the marriage never being consummated,
What does that actually mean in this context?
it means that even though Ireland was now officially part of the UK, the power imbalance and inequality were still massive.
Right.
So, as the British Empire was growing, it put a ton of pressure on Ireland.
Right.
Land, resources. But there were also these weird opportunities for some Irish people, Protestant elites. They fit right into UK and imperial politics.
The Duke of Wellington, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
But it wasn't just them. Even Catholics and Presbyterians were serving as soldiers, sailors, you name it. So you've got this paradox where an Irish laborer could be oppressed at home by British colonialism,
Yeah.
but also be part of that same colonialism abroad. It's a weird mix of identities.
So even though some Irish people were part of the empire's growth, the majority back home were in a pretty fragile situation.
Exactly.
And this is around the time when political economy starts becoming this big thing, right?
Right. It gets really big in Britain during the late 18th and early 19th century. And it wasn't just some academic theory. It had a ton of influence on how the government operated. They really believed they could understand and predict human behavior through the market. Free markets were seen as this super modern thing, the way of the future.
It was almost like a religion, wasn't it?
Yeah, like a secular faith.
This belief in the market, these unchangeable rules. And it's all about progress. And that connects to how Britain saw its empire too, right?
For sure. They weren't just about taking resources anymore.
Right.
Colonies were seen as sources of raw materials and places to sell their manufactured goods. This is the context for understanding Robert Peel's big decision in 1845.
You have to open free trade in grain.
Exactly. It was like this religious moment for them, the dawn of a new era.
And there's this whole idea of natural laws in economics, right?
Right, like the laws of physics, but for economics. And since these laws were natural, they must be divine, right?
So to mess with the free market was basically like defying God's will.
Pretty much. It was a super strong justification for a hands-off approach, even when people were suffering. Britain saw itself as this super successful empire built on free trade and free labor, so this whole ideology just validated that.
Okay, so we've got this belief in free markets, almost like a religion, and this sense of British superiority that goes along with it. How did they view the Irish people through this lens?
So here's where it gets tricky. Free in the British Empire meant you were civilized.
Right.
You had to participate in wage labor and the market economy. That's what a civilized person did.
Okay.
And the Irish, well, they were somewhere above enslaved people in their hierarchy,
Right.
but not by much. They weren't seen as industrious or market-oriented enough.
It's a pretty messed up comparison, right? Like, you've got Frederick Douglass, who saw the struggle of the Irish poor and connected it to the struggle of enslaved people in America. And then you've got someone like Thomas Carlyle basically saying, oh, Irish emancipation is just like black laborers in the Caribbean refusing to work.
It is messed up. For Carlyle, both groups were lazy and needed to be forced to be productive. It just shows this deep prejudice and a really twisted definition of freedom and civilization.
So we've got this society facing huge pressure, viewed through this distorted lens by the British, and they're on the verge of a major crisis. Now let's talk about their dependence on the potato and the warning signs they might have missed.
Right. So with all the pressure on Irish land, thanks to the British Empire, the potato became the main food source. It was really efficient, so tenant farmers could even pay their laborers with tiny plots of land to grow potatoes. Those were the conifer tenants. And Scanlan points out that, like, as early as 1735, there were people talking about how dependent the Irish were on potatoes. So this vulnerability existed long before the Great Famine. There was even a famine back in 1740, 1741 because of bad weather, and a huge number of people died. Proportionally, it might have been even worse than the Great Famine, so there were definitely warning signs.
So Ireland was already in a precarious position, economically speaking. And the British had a very specific view of them, right? How did they see Ireland's role in their empire?
Basically, Britain saw Ireland as a source of cheap labor and money.
Right.
Scanlan even calls it careless and violent exploitation.
Wow.
But interestingly, Irish people were already emigrating to America in large numbers during the 18th century, way more than the English, so they were looking for opportunities elsewhere. The British did ease up on some of their anti-Catholic policies because they needed manpower for the empire.
Makes sense.
Things like the Quebec Act gave some rights back to French Catholics in Canada to keep them loyal.
Right.
And Irish soldiers, Catholic and Presbyterian, became important in the British Army and the East India Company. So the empire needed them, even if they were prejudiced against them.
Let's go back to the Act of Union for a second. You mentioned the 1798 rebellion and how Pitt thought a union was the best way forward. What did people in Ireland think about that?
Well, Pitt's government, after they crushed the rebellion, saw the Act of Union as a way to bring the Anglo-Irish Protestants and Presbyterians closer to the UK.
Right.
They also thought they could slowly give Catholics more rights. The goal was a safer, more united empire.
Sure.
But a lot of people in Ireland saw it as a total betrayal. They were losing their independence, and they felt like it was just another way for the British to control them.
Yeah.
They were afraid Ireland would always be second best to England.
So there were attempts to make things better after the Act of Union, right?
Yeah, like this idea of improving the Irish poor. People like Mary Leadbeater, a Quaker writer, thought they could gradually reform the poor with the help of the upper classes.
Like a moral improvement.
Exactly. She wrote these cottage dialogues to
Yeah.
show British and Irish readers what poverty was like and how they could fix it. She even said it was in The Landlord's Friend,
Interesting.
meaning it would benefit the wealthy too. But after the Napoleonic Wars ended in 1815, whatever excitement there was for the Union died down.
Why is that?
Well, grain prices crashed across Europe, and that hit Ireland hard because they were exporting a lot of grain to Britain during the war.
I see.
Rent money kept flowing out of Ireland, and there wasn't much investment coming in. People relied more and more on the potato because their farms were getting smaller. And Irish industries couldn't compete with cheaper British goods, so there were fewer jobs and low wages. For the British, The problem wasn't rebellion anymore. It was poverty and a fragile economy in Ireland.
So it's fascinating. Ireland was exporting food to Britain, but the Irish people were getting poorer.
Absolutely. Exports of wheat and oats went way up. By the 1840s, Ireland was Britain's main source of imported grain, plus a ton of meat and other things. But Irish merchants were stuck. They couldn't control prices, and British trade practices made it harder for them.
Wow.
And all this while living standards were dropping and Irish industries were dying out because they couldn't compete with the British.
So right before the famine, you've got political tension with the Repeal Association wanting to get rid of the Act of Union, and Ireland is in this really vulnerable economic position.
Definitely. They became what economists call a small open economy, which means they were really susceptible to global market changes. They were exporting food while their own people were struggling to survive on potatoes. Food security was a huge issue, maybe even bigger than the debate about repealing the Union.
So let's talk about the everyday lives of the rural poor in Ireland at this time. How did they deal with markets, debt, and depending on potatoes?
It was a very tough life. These landless laborers and small farmers were always trying to balance rent, unpredictable wages, and the price of potatoes. And because the British economy was so closely tied to Ireland, all the changes in that system hit the Irish countryside hard.
Right.
British people thought Irish agriculture was stuck in the past, but actually the British market was forcing them into smaller farms and pushing rents higher.
Yeah. And then there's this idea that the Irish economy was based on barter because there wasn't much cash around. That seems like the British were trying to make them look less advanced, right?
Exactly. Because they were using this political economy lens, they thought that because the Irish didn't use much money, they were stuck in some primitive barter system.
Right.
But it wasn't that the Irish were backward, it was that the British economic system was sucking all the cash out of Ireland.
So they were adapting to a system where there wasn't much money.
Exactly.
But even with all this pressure, there were still examples of resistance in the countryside, weren't there?
Oh, absolutely. There were a lot of what they called outrages, basically. Protests and acts of sabotage to stop changes in farming practices, evictions, or rent increases. Like, there's a case from 1829 on Lord Gosford's land where a new tenant who tried to consolidate farms was met with violence and his crops were destroyed.
So they were fighting back against these changes.
They were. And on top of that, many of the rural poor had to migrate just to survive. Men would go to England for the harvest season to earn extra money, while women and children would beg in other parts of Ireland.
It's hard to imagine.
It was a tough existence, and for the Connacher tenants, if the potato crop failed, it was a complete disaster. Prices would spike, and what was scarcity turned into mass hunger and disease. Things like typhus and scurvy were direct results of this precarious life.
And we can't forget Thomas Malthus and his ideas about population growth, which were applied to Ireland and the potato.
Right. Malthus was worried about how fast the Irish population was growing, and he blamed the potato for that. He thought that the Irish were lazy and only starvation would force them to work harder. These ideas were really influential, and they shaped how the British dealt with poverty in both England and Ireland. The Poor Law Amendment Act of 1834, which created those awful workhouses, was meant to scare people away from relying on public assistance.
Okay, so let's talk about the people's potato itself. There's this crazy claim that Irish laborers ate like 12 to 14 pounds of potatoes every day. Is that true?
No, that's a myth. Scanlan debunks that pretty thoroughly. It's just not physically possible to eat that much every day. A normal person eats about 4 pounds of food in total per day. So while potatoes are a good source of calories, eating that much would be pretty sickening.
Okay, so it's an exaggeration, but the potato was still super important to Irish life.
Absolutely. It was the foundation of their diet, their social life, everything. And because it was so abundant in good years, people shared and supported each other. It wasn't just about individual survival.
And it wasn't just food for humans either. It was part of a whole system with pigs and turf. Can you explain that?
Yeah, so potatoes fed both people and pigs. And pigs were essential for paying rent. They were sold to the British, who loved Irish pork. Turf, which is basically dried peat, was used for cooking and heating.
Okay.
But the system was really fragile. If the potato crop failed, everything collapsed.
Let's talk more about the pigs. They seem to have a kind of strange role in this whole story.
It's interesting because the Irish laborers who raised the pigs rarely ate the pork themselves.
Really?
It was almost all exported to Britain. There's even a saying, the pig is him as pays the rent. So the more pigs they raised, the more likely they could stay on their land. But it also meant living really close to animals, which could be dangerous because of diseases.
And turf, while it seems like it was plentiful, also had some symbolic meaning.
Right. Peat was Ireland's main source of fuel, but the British saw it as another sign that the Irish were backward. They were using coal for their industries, and they thought using peat was primitive.
So the British were judging them for how they lived, even though they were the ones who created the conditions that made them live that way.
Exactly.
So to go back to the potato, it wasn't just about food. It was part of their culture and how they related to each other.
Absolutely. Sharing potatoes was a big part of their community. They were used in social events, marriages, everything. The British didn't understand that. They thought Irish families were too big and that they got married too young. But having children was important for survival in their situation.
Right. It wasn't just about being irresponsible. It was a way of life.
Exactly. And even their clothes, which were often homemade or secondhand, were criticized by the British. They had a very specific idea of how the poor should behave and dress.
So when the potato blight hit in 1845,
Hmm.
were people completely surprised, or were there some who expected it?
Well, while the scale of the blight was unexpected, the possibility of potato crop failures wasn't new.
Right.
But what's really disturbing is that some British officials and commentators might not have been that upset about it.
Really? Why?
They already had this negative view of the Irish, and the famine seemed to confirm their prejudices. There's this awful editorial in the Times that blamed the blight on the Irish being lazy and eating too many potatoes. Yeah, they said it was a chance for the Irish to become carnivorous and work harder. It's a pretty horrific example of how they saw the situation.
That's messed up. Okay, so let's get into how the blight actually unfolded. How did Peel's government respond at first?
Well, the blight arrived in August 1845, and it spread really quickly. Farmers had to dig up their potatoes early to try and save what they could. The blight turned the plants black, and they had this awful smell. The government's advice was to dry the potatoes, sort out the bad ones, and store the good ones in mounds.
Okay.
But there were problems with that. Most of the information was in English, so a lot of Irish speakers couldn't understand it. And it was hard to get the information out to remote communities. Even Punch magazine made fun of the government's response.
And all of this is happening while there's a lot of political tension in Ireland, right? With Daniel O'Connell's repeal movement and the Young Ireland group?
Yes, there was a lot going on politically. But Peel was focused on the famine. He saw it as a chance to change how the Irish lived, to get them away from potatoes and into a more market-based system.
I see.
This also connected to his own push for free trade and getting rid of the corn laws, which were protecting British grain farmers.
Right.
Even the Duke of Wellington said that rotten potatoes have done it all in pushing Peel towards free trade.
Wow.
And this decision to repeal the corn laws was a big deal. It actually caused a lot of problems for Peel and his government.
Really?
Yeah, his own party was divided about it. Some of his ministers resigned, and eventually Peel himself had to step down as prime minister in December 1845.
So the famine had a huge impact on British politics, too.
It did. But before Peel resigned, he did try to help. His government bought a lot of maize from America and sold it at a discount in Ireland. They also started public works programs to give people jobs. But the idea wasn't just to help, it was also to change the Irish economy.
Right.
They wanted to introduce new foods and get the Irish used to working for wages. They chose maize partly because it wouldn't compete with British grain and partly because they thought it was a better food for the working class.
It's kind of ironic, isn't it?
It is. And it's also a bit unsettling because they compared it to the food enslaved people ate in America. But not everyone in Britain agreed with Peel. Many Tories thought he was doing too much and didn't really believe the famine was that bad.
So even from the start, there were all these different factors influencing how the British responded. Politics, different ideas about the economy, and prejudice against the Irish.
Exactly. Some politicians used the famine to attack Peel and his ideas about free trade. And with all the crime that was happening in Ireland, there were debates about bringing in stricter laws to control things. The government was spending money on maize and public works, but it was all happening within this mess of political maneuvering and disagreements about how to deal with the situation.
And then you have Charles Trevelyan, the guy in charge of famine relief. He's a really important and controversial figure in this story. What's his background?
Right. Trevelyan was a powerful guy in the British government. His family was involved in slavery in the Caribbean, and he worked for the East India Company. He was a big believer in laissez-faire economics, which means he thought the government shouldn't interfere in the economy. He even wrote some anonymous letters where he criticized the Irish and said the government shouldn't do too much to help.
Wow. So basically, he didn't think the government should be responsible for helping people in need.
Pretty much. He saw Ireland as a colony and thought the Irish were lazy. He used the commissariat, which was an organization for supplying the British Army, to distribute aid. That tells you a lot about how he saw the situation.
So it was about efficiency and control, not really about helping people who were starving.
Unfortunately, yes.
And how did this whole bureaucratic system actually work in practice? Did it actually get aid to the people who needed it?
It was really slow and complicated.
Yeah, I can imagine.
To get a public works project approved, you had to go through all these different levels of bureaucracy. Local officials, then the Lord Lieutenant in Dublin, and finally the Treasury in London. This caused huge delays in getting aid where it was needed. And even when people did get work, the wages were deliberately low so they wouldn't become dependent on government help.
Wow. So even when they were trying to help, they were still making it hard for people.
Exactly.
Right.
Plus, a lot of the cost of these public works projects was put on Irish taxpayers.
So they were basically being asked to pay for their own relief during a famine.
Yes, it was very unfair. And because the wages were so low, there was a lot of unrest and even strikes among the workers. The Relief Commission was worried that people were taking advantage of the system, but the reality was that people were desperate.
Then came the fall of 1846, and the blight came back even worse than before. This seems like a real turning point in the famine.
Absolutely. The autumn of 1846 was devastating. The blight destroyed what was left of the potato crop. They called it Black 47 for a reason. Potato prices went through the roof, and even though there was maize available, a lot of people couldn't afford it or were too weak to cook it. People were so desperate they were eating rotten potatoes and even poisonous runoff. Diseases were spreading like wildfire, and crime was on the rise. And to make matters worse, there were rumors that the new potato crop was also infected with blight. The first relief commission was shut down right before the blight returned, which was really bad timing.
Scanlan calls this chapter The End of the World, The Return of the Blight, 1846-1847. That title really captures the despair of the situation.
It does. And there's this novel by William Carleton called The Black Prophet that was being published at the time.
Really?
It's a pretty dark story, but it really predicted how bad things would get. After Peel was gone, the new Prime Minister, Lord John Russell, changed the focus of relief efforts. Instead of buying food directly, they focused on providing work through the Labor Rate Act. But the problem was that this work was paid for by Irish taxpayers.
So they were making the people who were already suffering pay for their own relief.
Exactly. It's pretty messed up. The government was spending a lot of money, but their approach was still based on this idea that people should work for their food. And for a lot of people, the elderly, the sick, those in remote areas, it just wasn't possible. They were too weak or too isolated to benefit from these programs.
So Russell really believed that free trade could solve the problem.
He did. He and his Whig government thought the market would take care of everything. They even reduced government grain purchases, keeping only a few depots in the worst-hit areas.
But that didn't really work, did it?
No, it didn't. In August 1846, there was a global grain shortage, and prices spiked. This made things even worse in Ireland because they were now relying on imported grain. Ships carrying grain would wait in harbors for prices to go up even higher while people were starving on shore. It was a classic example of the market failing to meet people's basic needs.
And the Labor Rate Act, which focused on public works, didn't really help either, right?
No, it was a bit of a mess. They wanted to create jobs, but the wages were so low that it discouraged people from working. And because the money came from Irish taxpayers, it put even more pressure on the local economy. The British saw these public works projects as a way to make the Irish more industrious, but it didn't really work that way. People often did the bare minimum, and landlords used the system to avoid paying for relief themselves.
It's tragic because even with all this effort, it wasn't really addressing the core problem.
Exactly. And to make matters worse, we have to remember the physical and psychological toll of starvation itself.
Yeah, it's hard to even imagine what people were going through.
There are actually scientific studies on starvation, like the Minnesota starvation experiment, that show how extreme hunger affects both the body and the mind. And in Ireland, the suffering was widespread and intense. People were dying in the streets, diseases were rampant, and there weren't even enough resources to bury the dead properly. Crime rates skyrocketed as people became desperate for food.
It's just horrific. And on top of that, you have this British stereotype of the Irish exaggerating their poverty.
Right. They accuse them of making a poor mouth. But then you have these accounts from people like Nicholas Cummins, who wrote a letter from Skibbereen that was published in the Cork Examiner.
I've heard of that letter.
It was incredibly powerful. He described the conditions in detail, people literally dying of starvation, and it really shocked people in Britain. It helped to change public opinion, even among those who were skeptical before.
So the truth was undeniable.
It was. And it's interesting how this period has become part of Irish folk memory. There were all these stories about the famine, some of them almost unbelievable, about people surviving against all odds, and others about the terrible things that happened. There's this theme of rough justice, of people getting what they deserved, both good and bad. It shows how deeply this event is ingrained in the Irish psyche.
And there are even accounts of cannibalism, right?
Yes, unfortunately. When people are starving, they do desperate things. There are stories in Irish folklore about cannibalism, and there are also official reports that documented these cases. It's a really dark side of the famine that shows just how extreme the situation was.
Then there's the story of Alexis Soyer and his soup kitchens. He was a celebrity chef, right?
He was quite famous in London. And he set up these technologically advanced soup kitchens in Dublin using these huge boilers that could feed thousands of people. It was quite a spectacle, attracting wealthy donors and government officials. Sawyer was really proud of how efficient his kitchens were, but the people in Dublin had mixed feelings about them. There were even ballads written making fun of his soup.
Really?
Yeah, they called it soup quackery and said it wasn't very nutritious. But the government liked it because it was cheap. So even in the midst of all this suffering, there was still this focus on cost effectiveness and control.
So the public works projects and the soup kitchens weren't really solving the problem. And the British government was spending a lot of money.
Right. So in 1847, they passed the Poor Relief Ireland Bill, which put the responsibility for famine relief on local poor law unions.
So basically they were shifting the burden onto the Irish themselves.
Pretty much. Russell called for self-reliance, but the reality was that the Irish were already struggling to cope. And this led to more problems because the poor law unions were funded by local taxes, so the poorest areas had the least resources to deal with the crisis.
And on top of all that, there were calls for more forceful measures to control the unrest in Ireland.
Yes, there was a lot of debate about bringing in a coercion act, which would give the government more power to crack down on crime and dissent. Russell was reluctant to do this at first, but eventually he did pass the Crime and Outrage Act. There was also the Young Ireland Rebellion in 1848, led by William Smith O'Brien, but it was quickly crushed.
So even in the midst of the famine, there was still this political struggle going on.
There was. And the British response was often contradictory. They wanted to help, but they also wanted to control. And their actions were always shaped by their views of the Irish and their ideas about how the economy should work.
And the blight kept coming back, didn't it?
Yes, in the autumn of 1848, it returned for a third time. Conditions remained dire, especially in the western counties, which were already the poorest. The cost of poor law relief was skyrocketing, and the burden on Ireland was becoming unbearable.
It's hard to imagine how people kept going.
It was a truly dark time. And the workhouses, which were supposed to be a last resort for the destitute, became symbols of the system's cruelty. They were overcrowded, disease-ridden, and the conditions were designed to be harsh to discourage people from relying on them. But for many, there was simply nowhere else to go.
And even the workhouses weren't enough to cope with the scale of the crisis.
Right. The poor law unions were struggling to collect enough taxes to fund relief. And because landlords were responsible for paying the rates on unoccupied properties, they started evicting tenants to avoid those costs.
So the very people who were supposed to be providing some kind of safety net were actually making the situation worse.
It's a terrible irony. And those who were evicted often had nowhere to go but the workhouse, which was already overflowing.
And then there's the Encumbered Estates Act, which seems to have accelerated this process of displacement.
Yes, this was a law passed in 1849 that made it easier to sell off debt-ridden estates.
So basically it allowed landlords to get rid of their land and their responsibilities.
Exactly. A special commission was set up to handle these sales, and a huge amount of Irish land changed hands. The idea was to make land a more marketable commodity, but it also led to mass evictions. They called it the clearance system, and it was basically a way to get rid of tenants and consolidate farms.
But even as the famine was ending, the suffering continued for many.
It did, and these evictions were brutal. They would literally unroof houses to force people out. It was a traumatic experience for those who were forced to leave their homes.
So in a way, the famine reshaped the Irish landscape, both physically and socially.
It did. And its legacy is still felt today. It's a reminder of the devastating consequences of colonialism, neglect, and the failure of systems that are supposed to protect the vulnerable.
Now let's jump ahead a few years to 1851. You've got the Crystal Palace exhibition in London, this huge celebration of British industry and imperial power. And what's striking is that there's no mention of the Great Famine, this massive tragedy that had just happened a few years earlier.
It's like it was completely erased from the narrative. The Irish exhibits were part of the UK display, showing off this romanticized view of Irish culture and its potential for industrial development. There were replicas of the Tower brooch, furniture made from bog oak, and ordnance survey maps presented as tools for progress.
It's like they were trying to rewrite history to pretend that the famine never happened.
In a way, yes. It shows how powerful narratives of progress and unity can be in obscuring or even erasing the human cost of historical events.
So it's a reminder to be critical of these grand narratives, to look beyond the official story and see the complexity and the suffering that's often hidden beneath the surface.
Exactly. And to remember that history is always written from a particular